Dear colleagues, Jean-Louis gave me the mega task of briefly reviewing GDR architecture. Before I attempt to do this, I would like to support the idea to understand 20th century architecture in a new way as a common European space and to trace the continuities and ruptures of urban planning and architecture in it. As yesterday's discussion already showed, we need terms of this not longer juxtapose traditionalism and avant-gardism in architecture as irreconcilable extremes, but do not blur them either. This dualistic thinking had its peak during the Cold War in the 1950s, when the so-called Free West was identified with the international modernism and the Soviet-dominated socialist camp with the regional historicism. Within the framework of the theory of totalitarianism, the latter could even be brought close to the architectural policy of German National Socialism. The prototypical implementation of this way of thinking can be seen in the political and aesthetic contrast between the two outstanding urban ensembles in 1950s Berlin, namely the East Berlin Stalinallee and the International Building Exhibition Interbau 1957 in West Berlin. Both were planned and perceived as a build confrontation. The GDR then reacted to the Interbau once again with the second construction phase of Karl-Marx-Allee. This competition of architecture was a competition of promises for the future. It was initiated even before the wall was built in 1961. Berlin is now attempting to nominate these three ensembles of post-war modernism in the formerly divided city together for the World Heritage List. For this reason alone, we must rethink modernity. However, one wishes to broaden the concept of modernity, one will perhaps be able to agree on the thesis that the opposition between avant-gardism and traditionalism is a contradiction that first arose with the modern bourgeois society and is immanent to it, and that must be overcome in both representative, democratic, and authoritarian dictatorial society. This opposition took very different historical, political, and aesthetic forms. There have been moderate periods of European dictatorships and authoritarian periods of parliamentary democracies, whereby our political choice, of course, should be fixed in favor of a libertarian and socio-ecologically orientated modernity in Europe. Without a reassessment of the socialist architectures of Eastern Europe, we cannot reassure ourselves of our common history as East European countries, and will hardly be able to bring this, in many ways also problematic, heritage into the common Europe. With these preliminary remarks, I come to my topic, architecture and urban planning in the German Democratic Republic from 1950 to 1990. And given the shortness of time, this can only be some spotlights. First of all, it's important for me to note that it's probably true for all Eastern European countries that after the end of the war in 1945, there were certainly attempts to continue the social and aesthetics modernism of the interwar period. To make the periodization more precise, I would therefore suggest separating the years 1945 to 1948 or 9 from the period of socialist realism and Soviet hegemony. For example, the Soviet occupying power appointed the modernist architect Hans Scharoun as the first city councillor for urban planning in Berlin after the war. Inspired by the Athens Charter, the so-called collective plan of 1946, under his direction, envisaged a complete reorganization and zoning of Berlin along the river valley. These were plans that started from the overcoming private ownership of land, aimed at an orderly urban development in the general interest, and tried to continue the aesthetic heritage of modern building movement. Parallel thinking was taking place in Warsaw or in London. Here are some designs for the so-called residential cell Friedrichshain, Wohnzelle Friedrichshain in Berlin, and the typological study by the Swiss Hans Schmidt for Warsaw. There were also plans for the reconstruction of the war-ravaged Dresden, inspired by Corbusier's Cité Radieuse. The Dutchman Mart Stam, who like Hans Schmidt had worked in the Soviet Union in the early 1930s, became the rector of the Merch School of Arts and Crafts and the Academy of Arts. He, Mart Stam, hoped to create a new Bauhaus. Although these plans were discarded, as the following three pictures show, by the way of example, building in this spirit had already begun in East Germany. Here's the balcony access house on the former Stalinallee by the architect Ludmilla Herzstein and colleagues, and one of the rows of flats that tie in directly with the housing construction of the Weimar Republic. And this student residence in Potsdam is also a balcony access house. In my opinion, it would make a lot of sense to carry out a comparative analysis with other Eastern European countries to see which concepts and actors were used there for architecture and urban planning immediately after the Second World War and what initial results this had. Was there an international exchange with professionals' contacts still from the time before the war? What was the relationship between tradition and renewal in the countries? Where did the modern architects stand at the end of the war in their countries? In Poland, for example, Elena and Szymon Cyrkos, modern architects related to the resistance against the German occupation. The Soviet hegemony asserted itself, as did to a greater or lesser extent in all Eastern European countries. In the GDR as well, and found expression in particular in the changed understanding of architecture and urban planning. After the legendary trip of East German architects, urban planners, and building officials to Moscow in the spring of 1950, Berlin's plans were changed. Stalinallee served as a demonstration site, and the buildings already erected on Stalinallee, such as the already had shown balcony access house and the row-shaped residential buildings, were the object of polemics against formalism and cosmopolitanism. Genau, Cosmopolitan und so weiter, der Kosmopolitismus. Walter Gropius, Hannes Meyer and Ernst May became the main opponents. The latter two had also worked in the Soviet Union. With the 16 Principles of Urban Development of 1950, which were later also fixed in the Construction Law, Aufbaugesetz, the guiding principles of building and national traditions were formulated. Because of the underground urban infrastructure in Berlin, especially, that had not been destroyed in the war so much, but also because of the understanding that socialism continued the valuable aspects of previous cultures, greater importance was attached to the existing city than was the case with the representatives of the avant-garde. Housing as a basic condition of human existence had constitutional status in the GDR from the very beginning. Housing should not have a character of commodity, but was a service provided by the state. This included rent control at the lowest possible level and municipal housing control. Here, aspiration and reality collided painfully. The lack of housing accompanied the entire history of the GDR. In the beginning, the situation was further strained by war destruction and resettlement. Nevertheless, around 1950, the Siam principles of housing for the subsistence level were abundant, and ideological artistic expression was sought in architecture and the grand gesture in the confrontation with the West. Via the party press, a competition for the design of the high-rise building on the Weberwiese was staged as a search of the new German style. The term socialist realism was not used for architecture in the GDR. Within a week, the architects found answers to the party's demand. Hermann Henselmann won. His defeated colleagues Hans Hopp and Richard Paulik were allowed to build their own blocks on Stalinallee. Henselmann had invoked Berlin tradition in succession of Karl Friedrich Schinkel. After the individual ensemble, the next step was to plan a main avenue, the Stalinallee, the major arterial road to the east. Here's the first result from 1951. Not only a corridor street, but an avenue of oversized apartment blocks with palatial cour d'honneur, characteristic squares connected to the historic development in the rear area. The mental center was Richard Paulik's Sports and Congress Hall, which was faced by a monument to Stalin donated by the Soviet Union, one gift more. And one night in 1961, the monument disappeared and the street was henceforth named after Karl Marx. Here the oval Strausberger Platz with the buildings by Hermann Henselmann. The most representative residential palace was designed by Richard Paulik, Gropius confidant, Bauhäusler, former Bauhäusler, and China immigrant. And finally, the buildings at the Frankfurter Tor, again by Hermann Henselmann. With the Stalinallee in East Berlin, the GDR realized the building task of the socialist magistral, typical for all Soviet-dominated country. In a sense, there were built stage prospectuses of the future, more than Potemkin villages, built promises for the future in the here and now, inhabited by the activists who were to be worthwhile for all to emulate. As you surely know, there was an idea to jointly nominate the socialist main worlds of Eastern Europe for the UNESCO World Heritage List as a serial application, which failed already due to the political differences between Russia and Ukraine before the war. But even without Russia and Belarus, which would only be considered for official participation again under different political conditions, I think the project would still be of architectural and cultural historical importance. To my knowledge, there's no comparative study of this special urban form, which, by the way, also made a new career for itself after socialism, whether in the new national historical narratives or in terms of real estate. From a postmodern understanding, Aldo Rossi once praised today's Karl-Marx-Allee in East Berlin, quotation, as the last European boulevard built. The rather short period of historicism and neoclassicism in GDR dated from 1950 to 1955. In addition to the construction of socialist main thoroughfares, this was primarily the construction of new industrial cities. This was a problem and a project common to all former socialist countries too, catching up modernization, building up their new heavy industry, and the material technical basis of socialism required the construction of metallurgical combines and the associated residential towns. The counterpart to Stalinallee in East Berlin was the construction of Stalin, or now Eisenhüttenstadt, city for iron foundry. Here's a plan of building completed until 1906. According to Germany's first socialist street, Stalinallee was the first socialist city in Germany, the reference to the competitor in the West is abundantly clear. Here's some more slides on Eisenhüttenstadt. When the turn to modern building began, this was also expressed in the design of Eisenhüttenstadt's main street leading to the factory. Tower blocks, pavilion buildings for shops, a department store as a low-rise building, a new era was dawning. Where's the comparative companion of these new industrial cities of Eastern Europe, whose history goes back to the Soviet industrialization? We already met, I would say, 10 or more years before in Donau-Walasz in Hungary to speak about this subject, but I don't know a comparative study of all these new industrial towns of Eastern Europe. And what was become of the initiative to bring together the new industrial cities of Eastern Europe in a UNESCO, in a serial UNESCO application? Why don't we write at the end of the fossil age the common history of East Central Europe after 1945, which, not unlike the history of Western Europe, was founded on the coal and steel industry. Montanunion is the basic of the European Union, and of course we have a history of coal and steel in Eastern Europe also. At the end of the war, the GDR lacked 1 million flats, but in 1958 there were still 730,000. After the death of Stalin and the workers' uprising of June 1953 in GDR, the investment policy was corrected and the subsidies for housing construction were now primarily intended to benefit workers. But it took the All-Union Building Conference in Moscow in 1954 and the first building conference in the GDR in 1955 to break away from the aesthetic requirements of national traditions and the ideological expectations of architecture as building art. Floor plans, room height, facade designs of the traditionally produced and elaborately decorated buildings had made housing construction enormously more expensive. The economic insight was combined with the rediscovery of central principle of the new building, typification, serial building, and the industrialization of building. The second construction phase of the Karl-Marx-Allee, planned from 1958 and realized until 1964, demonstrated the new paradigm in the GDR. From the outset, it was not about the extension of the avenue alone, but about a larger inner city residential area and at the same time about the modern reinterpretation of the Magistral. The architectural paradigm continued to have an effect, but was changed to modern forms. The large apartment blocks with their endless facade and ground floors were dissolved. The residential buildings receded, pavilion buildings near the street, green spaces in front of the apartment buildings, like couronneurs, alterned with each other, allowing pavilions and apartment buildings to appear mobile with the movement in the space, granting views into the residential areas on the Magistral. There are no longer prospects for the future, no longer promises for the future, but signaled an arrival in everyday life, a promise of the worldliness. In this perhaps classic phase of modern socialist architecture, the typified residential buildings and the more elaborately designed public buildings still belong entirely to one design family. The pavilions are designed as a series and serve upscale consumption, while the cinema and the large restaurant are special buildings. The cinema and the inside of the cinema and the restaurant, Moscow. The social infrastructure buildings in the residential areas were typified, but were developed specially for this area. Also, the new Carmaxally remained a fragment at the time and was to be designed in a restrained manner compared to the concentration of use and the increase in architectural expression at Alexanderplatz. It has outstanding urban qualities. The house of the teacher with the Congress Hall formed the transition from the Carmaxally to Alexanderplatz. And Alexanderplatz formed the point of intersection between Carmaxally and the streets unter den Linden and Rathausstraße, both of which encompass the inner city space around the television tower. Alexanderplatz was planned and realized after the second stage of Carmaxally. What Stalinallee was as the first socialist city in the period of the building policy of national traditions, Halle Neustadt, New Town, officially the fourth new socialist city of the GDR, is for the phase of socialist modernity. Connected to the city of Halle by an elevated road, suburban railway and tramway, it was an independent city for the chemical workers of Buna and Leuna. Planned by the aforementioned former Bauhäusler Richard Paulik, the experimental character can still be felt, the attempt to shape the large-scale form of the city for many 10,000s of residents. The design of the center followed the principle of urbanity through density. Remarkable architecture can still be found, be it the wonderful round kindergarten, the residential area center designed as a passenger system, or the ensemble of swimming hall and dormitory for students, decorated with murals by the Spanish artist Josep Renau. And also the social infrastructure buildings for this city were still made separately. In the 1970s, the last consequences of the war were removed from the inner cities. The socialist transformation of the district towns was on the agenda. And I can only show here, because of the time, some examples like Dresden. We saw the plan of Dresden here, the Prager Straße as a model, and during the time of the GDR, the new access without private transport into the center of Dresden. And you see the main urban space, public space, by a Wohnmaschine and some hotels. And the same structure, or similar structure in Chemnitz. In Chemnitz, I would say, and that is Magdeburg. Finally, the construction of new buildings outside the inner cities led to a situation where, despite high numbers of housing construction, the existing stock of old buildings fell into disrepair, and de facto there was no more growth in housing. It was far too late to focus on the redevelopment of inner cities and the reconstruction of existing old buildings. In conclusion, however, I will show you some interesting buildings, cultural buildings, which have sculptural qualities, stand in significance. Places in the city centers are protected as monument, and in all but one case still exist. Here you see the confrontation between the mass housing program and the special cultural objects, like at the theater of Schwedt an der Oder, with the mural in the upper foyer by Ronald Paris, or the Chemnitz Congress City Hall, Chemnitz City Hall, that houses many works of art, such as the Galileo sculpture by Fritz Kremer and the mural by Horst Sickelbein, or directly opposite the Marx head by Lev Kerbel. And you have known that Chemnitz was nominated as the next German European City of Culture for the year 2025, also with this architectural artistic ensemble. And it's a German way to appropriate this heritage. And in Dresden, the discussion about the Kulturpalast was easy. Cultural Palace was eased by the fact that the large hall was converted into a concert hall that was needed in Dresden. And the house has been renovated, and even the ideological mural, the way of the red flag, has been refurbished, and it is a self-evident part of the listed monument. You see it here. The Leipzig Gewandhaus, also a concert hall, was completed in 1981. Is also completely indisputable. It houses the largest ceiling painting in Europe. The painter Sighart Gille gave it the title "Song of Life." Only the Palace of Republic, parliamentary seat and house of culture, opened in 1976, in which the first freely elected parliament of the GDR was constituted in March 1990, has not survived the new era. After the asbestos removal, there was an interim use of cultural initiatives who saw in the shell a chance for a solution beyond the GDR palace and the Prussian castle, which had been demolished in 1950 after being destroyed in the war. The word doubt accompanied this phase of reflection, but the reappropriation of the building as the shell of a united Germany was prevented. The political majority wanted to demolish the building. Now the Berlin Palace has been resurrected as the Humboldt Forum and has to deal above all with the colonial origins of the collections. Irony of history is that a significant part of the current program deals with the history of the site. After its death, the GDR Palace is experiencing its resurrection by exhibition, symposia, and spolia in the synthetic old new castle. In one of the staircases, you will find this artistic work, which is reminiscent of the facade of the previous building. The reassessment and re-evaluation of GDR architecture, and particularly of the socialist modernism of the late 50s to late 70s, however, has been promoted by no event as strongly as by the demolition of the Ahornblatt Maple Leaf restaurant in Berlin, a construction of 5 double curved concrete shells built in 1969 by Ulrich Müther. The brutal demolition of the listed building in July 2001 also brought a change in public opinion. And a decade later, the state government took up the proposal to put both sections of East Berlin's Karl-Marx-Allee and the buildings of the 1957 International Building Exhibition, the Interbau in West Berlin, together on the German proposal list of World Cultural Heritage. Motto at that time, confrontation, competition, and co-evolution of modernity. Last autumn, this proposal was renewed, and we are expecting the International Expert Commission soon. Thank you very much for your attention.